My name is Margaret Chen, and I've served as a federal district judge for the Northern District of California for the past 12 years, a position one earned through decades of tireless work as a prosecutor, then as a defense attorney, and finally as a legal scholar who specialized in property law and constitutional rights. But none of that mattered on the morning of October 15th when I stood in my driveway watching my century-old Victorian home, the house my grandmother built with her own hands after immigrating from China in 1924, the house where my mother was born, the house where I took my first steps and spoke my first words, engulfed in flames that reached so high into the early morning sky that they seemed to claw at the clouds themselves. And as I stood there in my pajamas with my phone clutched in my trembling hand, I knew with absolute certainty that this was no accident, because just 3 weeks earlier, Richard Pemberton, the president of the Clearwater Hills Homeowners Association, had stood in this very same driveway with his arms crossed over his polo shirt embroidered with the HOA logo, and told me in no uncertain terms that if I didn't voluntarily join their association and submit to their rules, they would find a way to make my life so unbearable that I'd have no choice but to leave. And I had laughed in his face, not because I thought he was joking, but because I found it absurdly audacious that this middle-aged real estate agent with delusions of grandeur thought he could intimidate a federal judge. And I told him that my property had been in my family since before his precious Clearwater Hills development even existed, that my land was specifically excluded from the HOA covenants when the neighborhood was developed in 1987 because my grandmother had refused to sell to the developers, and that no amount of harassment or intimidation would ever make me surrender the independence and rights that my family had fought so hard to maintain. But Richard had simply smiled that cold, calculated smile that I would come to know so well and said, "We'll see about that, Judge Chen, we'll see about that." And now, as I watched firefighters pour thousands of gallons of water onto what remained of my family's legacy, I understood that Richard Pemberton and his HOA cronies had declared war, and they had no idea that they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives, because while I may have looked like a devastated victim standing there in my pajamas with tears streaming down my face, I was already formulating a strategy that would not only bring them to justice but would expose the corruption and criminality that had been festering in Clearwater Hills for years, turning what should have been a peaceful suburban community into something that resembled a petty dictatorship run by small-minded tyrants drunk on the minuscule the amount of power they'd been given. The fire marshal arrived around noon after the flames had finally been extinguished, and I watched as Chief Anderson walked through the smoldering ruins of my home, taking photographs, collecting samples, and making notes on his tablet. And when he finally approached me where I sat in my car wrapped in a blanket provided by one of the paramedics, his face was grim, and he said, "Judge Chen, I need to be honest with you, this fire shows clear signs of arson. We found evidence of accelerants in multiple locations, specifically around the foundation and near what appears to have been your electrical panel, and the burn patterns suggest someone knew exactly what they were doing. This was planned and executed by someone with knowledge of how to make it look like an electrical fire while ensuring maximum damage." And I nodded slowly, unsurprised by his findings, because I had suspected as much from the moment I'd woken to the smell of smoke at 4:30 that morning. And I told Chief Anderson about my ongoing dispute with the HOA, about Richard Pemberton's threats, about the escalating harassment that had included everything from complaints to the county about non-existent code violations to anonymous letters left in my mailbox warning me that accidents happen to people who don't cooperate. And Chief Anderson's expression grew darker with each detail I shared, and he assured me that he would be coordinating with the police department to launch a full criminal investigation. But I knew from years of experience in the legal system that investigations could take months or even years, and evidence had a way of disappearing when the perpetrators had wealth, connections, and motivation to cover their tracks. So I decided that I would conduct my own parallel investigation, not to interfere with law enforcement but to ensure that justice would be served one way or another. And I started by reaching out to my law clerk, a brilliant young woman named Sarah Kowalski, who had clerked for me for 3 years and had recently taken a position at a prestigious firm in San Francisco. And when I called her that afternoon and explained what had happened, she didn't hesitate for even a second before saying, "Judge Chen, I'll take a leave of absence if I need to. Whatever you need from me, I'm there." And I felt a surge of gratitude because I knew I would need all the help I could get to take down an organization that had clearly been operating with impunity for far too long. The next morning, I checked into a hotel suite that I converted into a temporary command center, setting up my laptop, multiple monitors, a printer, and boxes of files that I'd had stored in a climate-controlled facility, copies of every deed, title, survey, and legal document related to my property dating back to 1924. And Sarah arrived at 8 a.m. sharp carrying her own laptop and a box of supplies, and we spent the entire day mapping out our strategy, starting with a comprehensive investigation into the Clearwater Hills HOA's history, leadership, financial records, and enforcement actions. And what we discovered in just those first few hours was shocking even to someone like me who had spent decades prosecuting white-collar criminals and corrupt officials, because the Clearwater Hills HOA wasn't just an overzealous neighborhood association. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been systematically exploiting homeowners, embezzling funds, and using intimidation tactics to silence anyone who dared to question their authority. And at the center of it all was Richard Pemberton, who had served as HOA president for 11 consecutive years, far exceeding the term limits supposedly set forth in the association's bylaws, and his wife Patricia served as the treasurer, creating a family dynasty that controlled every aspect of the neighborhood's governance with an iron fist. And their adult son Brandon worked as the HOA's compliance officer, a position that essentially gave him carte blanche to harass residents over the most trivial alleged violations, while the family enriched themselves through inflated maintenance contracts, kickback schemes with vendors, and special assessments that seemed to materialize whenever the Pembertons wanted to fund their lavish lifestyle. Sarah pulled up the HOA's publicly filed tax returns, and we discovered that they had reported nearly $2.3 million in annual revenue from homeowner dues, special assessments, and violation fees. But when we cross-referenced their expenses with public records of actual work performed in the neighborhood, we found glaring discrepancies. They had paid $450,000 to a landscaping company called Greenscape Solutions for maintenance of common areas. But when Sarah called Greenscape pretending to be a potential customer, she learned that the company had gone out of business 3 years ago, and the phone number listed on the HOA's tax returns was a burner phone that had been disconnected, which meant the Pembertons had likely created a shell company to funnel HOA funds directly into their own pockets. And this was just the tip of the iceberg, because we found similar discrepancies with a snow removal company, a pool maintenance service, and a security firm, all of which either didn't exist or had no record of ever working for the Clearwater Hills HOA. And when we added up all the fraudulent expenses, we estimated that the Pembertons had embezzled somewhere between $3.50 and $4.2 million over the past decade. And I felt a cold fury building in my chest, because these weren't victimless crimes. Every dollar they'd stolen had come from hard-working families who were just trying to maintain their homes and live peacefully in their neighborhood. Families who had been led to believe that their HOA fees were going toward legitimate community improvements, when in reality they were funding the Pembertons' vacation homes, luxury cars, and country club memberships. But the financial crimes were only part of the story, because as Sarah and I dug deeper, we uncovered a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and outright violence directed at homeowners who had challenged the HOA's authority or refused to comply with arbitrary rules. And I started reaching out to former residents who had sold their homes and moved away from Clearwater Hills, and every single person I spoke with had a horror story to tell. There was Robert Martinez, a retired veteran who had been fined $25,000 for painting his front door a shade of blue that was supposedly not on the HOA's approved color palette, even though he had received written approval from the Architectural Review Committee before painting. And when Robert had refused to pay the fine and demanded to see the meeting minutes where the color had been disapproved, the HOA had placed a lien on his property and threatened to foreclose. And Robert, who was living on a fixed income, had no choice but to sell his home at a loss and move in with his daughter in another state. And then there was Jennifer Wu, a single mother who had installed a small playground set in her backyard for her disabled son, and the HOA had cited her for creating an unapproved structure and demanded she remove it immediately or face daily fines of $100. And when Jennifer had tried to explain that her son had autism and the playground was recommended by his therapist as a safe space for him to play and develop motor skills, Brandon Pemberton had shown up at her house and told her, "I don't care if your kid is disabled. Rules are rules, and if you don't like it, you can move to a neighborhood that allows white trash yards." And Jennifer had been so traumatized by the encounter that she'd sold her house within 6 months and moved to a different county. And there were dozens more stories just like these, families who had been driven out of their homes, through a campaign of systematic harassment orchestrated by the Pembertons and their allies on the HOA board. And the more I learned, the more I realized that burning down my house wasn't an aberration. It was simply the next escalation in a long pattern of criminal behavior that had been allowed to continue because nobody with the resources and expertise to fight back had ever challenged them before. On the third day of our investigation, I received a call from Detective James Morrison of the County Sheriff's Office, who had been assigned to investigate the arson, and he asked if I could come to his office to discuss the case. And when I arrived with Sarah in tow, Detective Morrison was not alone. Sitting across from him was a woman I'd never met who introduced herself as FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres, and my heart rate quickened because FBI involvement meant this case was bigger than I'd initially thought. And Agent Torres explained that the FBI had been investigating HOA fraud and corruption in California for the past 2 years as part of a larger initiative to combat what they called community association crime, and they had already opened preliminary investigations into several HOAs in the region, including Clearwater Hills, based on complaints from residents and suspicious financial patterns they'd identified through data analysis. And when Agent Torres learnt about the fire at my property and my connection to the case, she had immediately requested to be involved because she believed my situation could be the key to cracking open a much larger conspiracy. And she asked if I would be willing to cooperate with their investigation, and I said without hesitation, "Agent Torres, not only will I cooperate, but I have information that will accelerate your investigation by months, possibly years, because I've spent the last 3 days compiling evidence of massive fraud, embezzlement, racketeering, and witness intimidation, and I believe Richard Pemberton and his family are running a criminal enterprise that has victimized hundreds of people and stolen millions of dollars, and I'm going to help you take them down." Agent Torres and Detective Morrison exchanged glances, and I could see they were impressed but also cautious, and Agent Torres said, "Judge Chen, I appreciate your enthusiasm and your desire for justice, but I need to be clear that as a federal judge, your involvement in this investigation could create complications, particularly if this case ends up in federal court, which it likely will given the dollar amounts and interstate aspects we're uncovering, and we can't have any accusations that the investigation was biased or that evidence was tainted by judicial involvement." And I understood her concerns completely because I'd been a judge long enough to know how important it was to maintain the integrity of the judicial process. So I said, "I understand, Agent Torres, and I'm not suggesting that I lead the investigation or that I'm going to recuse myself from hearing any cases that might arise from it. Federal judges recuse themselves all the time when they have personal knowledge of the facts, and I would absolutely do so in this case. But what I'm offering is my cooperation as a victim and as a witness, and the evidence that Sarah and I have already compiled, which I'm happy to turn over to you with no strings attached, no special treatment, just a citizen helping law enforcement do their job." And Agent Torres smiled and nodded, clearly satisfied with my answer, and she said, "In that case, Judge Chen, we would very much appreciate your cooperation, and I'd like to schedule a formal interview where you can walk us through everything you've discovered. And I'd also like to introduce you to the financial crimes analyst on our team who can help us trace the money and build a comprehensive picture of the Pemberton's criminal enterprise over the next 2 weeks." I worked closely with Agent Torres and her team, providing them with all the documentation Sarah and I had compiled, sitting for multiple interviews where I detailed every interaction I'd had with Richard Pemberton and the HOA, and connecting them with former residents who had been victimized by the Pemberton schemes. And the FBI moved with impressive speed, obtaining warrants for the HOA's financial records, Richard Pemberton's personal and business bank accounts, and the email servers used by the HOA board. And when they executed those warrants on a cold Tuesday morning in early November, they hit the jackpot because Richard Pemberton had been arrogant enough to believe he was untouchable, and he had kept detailed records of every fraudulent transaction, every kickback payment, every shell company he'd created, all neatly organized in digital files that he thought were secure but which the FBI's cyber forensics team cracked within hours. And they also found email chains that were absolutely damning, including one where Richard had discussed with Patricia how they needed to deal with the judge problem, and another where he had told Brandon to make arrangements with our friend who handles special projects, which the FBI believed was a reference to the arson attack on my home. And when Agent Torres called me to tell me what they'd found, she said, "Judge Chen, we're going to bring federal charges, and we're going to make sure these people never hurt anyone again. But I need to warn you that the investigation into the arson is going to take a little longer, because we need to identify and locate the actual arsonist. And we're pursuing several leads, including financial records that show Richard made a $25,000 cash withdrawal 2 days before your house burned down, and we believe that money was used to pay someone to commit the crime. While the FBI investigation continued, I faced the practical challenge of rebuilding my life, and the insurance company initially tried to deny my claim, citing an exclusion for intentional acts in my policy, which was absurd because I hadn't intentionally burned down my own house. But the insurance adjuster, a smug man named Kevin who clearly enjoyed wielding what little power he had, insisted that because the fire was arson, the claim was denied, and he suggested I sue the actual arsonist to recover my losses, which was both legally ignorant and practically useless advice. So I politely informed Kevin that I was a federal judge with extensive knowledge of insurance law, and I would be filing a bad faith lawsuit against his company if they didn't reverse their decision within 48 hours. And I explained in precise legal terms why the intentional acts exclusion didn't apply when the homeowner was the victim rather than the perpetrator of the arson. And I cited several appellate court decisions that had addressed this exact issue, and Kevin stammered something about needing to consult with his supervisor. And exactly 47 hours later I received a call from the insurance company's regional director, who apologized profusely and assured me that my claim would be paid in full, including coverage for temporary housing, contents, and the full replacement value of the home, which amounted to just over $1.8 million given the historical significance and custom features of my grandmother's Victorian, and I accepted their apology with grace while privately noting that I would still be mentioning their initial denial to every attorney I knew who handled insurance litigation, because companies that tried to cheat their own policyholders in their moment of greatest need deserved to face consequences. By mid, the FBI's investigation had expanded beyond anything I could have imagined because Agent Torres and her team had discovered that Richard Pemberton wasn't just running a corrupt HOA in Clearwater Hills, he was actually part of a larger network of HOA board members, property managers, and vendors who had been collaborating to defraud homeowners associations across 3 states, California, Nevada, and Arizona, and they had developed a sophisticated playbook for their scheme that involved taking control of HOA boards through coordinated election fraud, installing family members or associates in key positions, creating shell companies to submit fraudulent invoices for services never rendered, using aggressive enforcement and intimidation tactics to silence dissent and drive out residents who might question their authority, and when they encountered particularly stubborn homeowners who refused to be intimidated, they would resort to property damage, harassment, and in at least 3 cases that the FBI had documented, arson attacks designed to either force the homeowner out or create insurance payouts that could be exploited, and the total amount of money that had been stolen through this network was estimated at somewhere between $47 million and $63 million, affecting more than 8,000 families across dozens of communities. And Agent Torres told me that this was shaping up to be one of the largest HOA fraud cases in American history, and the Department of Justice was planning to bring RICO charges against Richard Pemberton and 23 other defendants, which meant they would be treated as an organized criminal enterprise similar to the mafia or drug cartels. And I felt a grim satisfaction knowing that the man who had burnt down my family home was going to spend the rest of his life in federal prison. But then something happened that I didn't expect. On a Sunday evening in late November, I received a call from an unknown number, and when I answered, a woman's voice said, "Judge Chen, you don't know me, but my name is Patricia Pemberton, and I need to talk to you." And I was so shocked that I almost hung up immediately. But curiosity got the better of me, so I said, "Mrs. Pemberton, I'm not sure what we could possibly have to discuss, given that your husband burned down my house and you've been complicit in defrauding hundreds of homeowners." And there was a long pause before Patricia said, her voice cracking with emotion, "I know what Richard did, and I know what I've done, and I can't live with it anymore. I need you to know that I didn't know about the fire until after it happened. Richard told me he was going to handle the judge situation, but I thought he meant filing complaints or legal actions. I never thought he would do something so evil. And when I found out what he'd done, I was horrified. And I've been living in fear ever since, because I realized that if he was willing to burn down your house, what would he do to me if I tried to leave or if I told anyone what I knew?" And I could hear genuine terror in her voice. And despite everything she and her family had done to me and countless others, I felt a twinge of empathy because I'd spent my career dealing with abuse victims who had been trapped in relationships with controlling and violent people, and I recognized the pattern. So I said, "Mrs. Pemberton, if you're seriously afraid for your safety, you need to contact the FBI immediately. And if you're willing to cooperate with their investigation, they can offer you protection and potentially leniency in exchange for your testimony." And Patricia said, "I'm willing to tell them everything, every detail of every scheme, every shell company, every victim we drove out of their homes, all of it. But I need to know that they'll protect me from Richard because he's already talking about destroying evidence and fleeing the country. And he's been meeting with some very dangerous people, and I'm afraid of what he might do if he finds out I'm cooperating with law enforcement." I immediately called Agent Torres and explained the situation, and within an hour, the FBI had Patricia Pemberton in protective custody, and over the next 3 days, she sat for more than 30 hours of interviews, where she provided detailed testimony about every aspect of the criminal enterprise, including information about offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands where Richard had hidden more than $8 million in stolen HOA funds. And she revealed that Brandon Pemberton had personally committed several acts of vandalism and property damage against homeowners who had challenged the HOA, including slashing tires, spray painting, obscene graffiti on homes, and even poisoning one family's dog. And most importantly for my case, Patricia provided the name of the arsonist, a man named Marcus Webb, who had done construction work for Richard's real estate company and who Richard had paid $25,000 cash to burn down my house. And the FBI arrested Marcus Webb at his apartment in Sacramento, and after being informed that he was facing federal arson charges that carried a mandatory minimum of 20 years in prison, Marcus immediately agreed to cooperate and confirmed that Richard Pemberton had hired him to destroy my home, providing detailed testimony about their meetings, the planning that went into the attack, and even photographs he had taken of my house while surveilling it before the fire. And with Marcus's testimony and Patricia's corroboration, the case against Richard Pemberton became absolutely airtight, and the U.S. Attorney's Office authorized the FBI to arrest him on December 3rd. The day Richard Pemberton was arrested was one I will never forget because Agent Torres had called me the night before to let me know it was happening, and asked if I wanted to be present when they took him into custody. And I declined because I didn't want to do anything that might jeopardize the case or give Richard's defense attorneys ammunition to claim bias or prosecutorial misconduct. But Agent Torres promised to call me as soon as the arrest was made, and at 6:47 a.m. on that cold December morning, my phone rang, and Agent Torres said, "Judge Chen, Richard Pemberton is in custody, and I thought you'd like to know that when we arrived at his house with the arrest warrant, he actually tried to run. He went out the back door and tried to scale the fence in his backyard, but he's a 62-year-old man who hasn't exercised in probably 2 decades, and he made it about halfway up the fence before he lost his grip and fell. And our agents had to help him up because he'd twisted his ankle, and the whole time he was yelling about how this was all a misunderstanding, and how you had fabricated everything because you were angry about the HOA. And one of our agents finally got tired of his ranting and said, 'Sir, we have your emails, your bank records, and to cooperating witnesses who've provided detailed testimony about your crimes, so you might want to save your breath for your lawyer.' And Richard finally shut up, and I couldn't help but smile at the image of this pompous bully who had terrorized so many people, reduced to a pathetic figure trying to climb a fence to avoid accountability for his crimes. And Agent Torres continued, "He's being arraigned this afternoon in federal court, and I just wanted to give you a heads up in case you hear about it or if any media outlets reach out for comment. And I also wanted to thank you personally for your cooperation and your patience throughout this investigation, because without your help and the evidence you compiled, we might not have been able to build such a comprehensive case so quickly." The arraignment was held that afternoon before Magistrate Judge William Foster, and I learned from Sarah, who attended as a spectator, that Richard Pemberton had hired one of the most expensive criminal defense attorneys in California, a man named Lawrence Blackstone, who had made his reputation defending wealthy white-collar criminals, and Blackstone had argued forcefully for Richard's release on bail, claiming that his client was not a flight risk despite having offshore bank accounts and recent communications about leaving the country. And he argued that Richard was a respected member of the community who had served as HOA president for over a decade and who had no prior criminal record. And the assistant U.S. attorney prosecuting the case, a brilliant young woman named Jennifer Park, whom I knew from her time clerking for a colleague on the bench, had countered by presenting evidence of Richard's plans to flee, his substantial hidden assets that would make flight easy, and the severity of the charges he was facing, including racketeering, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit arson, and she argued that Richard posed a danger to the community. Given his history of intimidation and the fact that he had arranged to have a federal judge's home burned down, and after hearing both sides, Magistrate Judge Foster had ordered Richard held without bail, finding that no conditions of release could adequately protect the community or ensure his appearance at trial. And Sarah told me that Richard had visibly crumbled when he heard the decision, all his arrogance and confidence evaporating as he realized he would be sitting in a jail cell for the foreseeable future. And he had turned to Patricia, who was sitting in the spectator section, clearly hoping for some show of support, but Patricia had simply looked away, and Richard had been led out of the courtroom in handcuffs with his shoulders slumped and his head down, the image of a broken man who had finally faced consequences for his actions. Over the following weeks, more arrests were made as the FBI continued to dismantle the HOA fraud network, including Brandon Pemberton, who was charged with multiple counts of witness intimidation, vandalism, and conspiracy, and he too was denied bail after prosecutors presented evidence that he had made threatening phone calls to potential witnesses even after his father's arrest, and the property managers and vendors who had participated in the fraud scheme were also arrested, one by one, and the story became national news with headlines like, "Federal Judge's Home Burned in HOA Intimidation Scheme," and "Massive HOA Fraud Network Exposed After Arson Attack," and I started receiving calls from journalists requesting interviews, but I declined all of them on advice from the U.S. Attorney's Office, who wanted to make sure nothing I said publicly could potentially complicate the criminal cases. And I also started receiving messages from other homeowners across the country who had been victimized by their own HOAs, people who wanted advice or who simply wanted to share their stories with someone who would understand. And I was struck by how widespread this problem was and how many people had suffered in silence because they didn't think anyone would believe them or because they didn't have the resources to fight back against HOA boards with teams of lawyers. And I realized that while my case had brought attention to the issue, there was still so much work to be done to reform the laws governing homeowners associations and to provide better protections for homeowners who found themselves at the mercy of corrupt boards. The criminal cases moved forward through the federal court system, and in March of the following year, Richard Pemberton went to trial on charges of racketeering, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit arson. And I of course recused myself from any involvement in the case given my status as a victim, and the case was assigned to Judge Harold Martinez, a senior district judge with decades of experience handling complex white-collar crime cases, and Sarah attended the trial every day and provided me with updates, and she told me that the prosecution's case was devastating, with Patricia Pemberton providing several days of testimony that detailed every aspect of the criminal enterprise, explaining how she and Richard had systematically defrauded homeowners, created shell companies, embezzled millions of dollars, and orchestrated campaigns of harassment against anyone who challenged their authority. And she testified that Richard had specifically targeted me because he saw me as a threat, not just because I refused to join the HOA, but because I had the legal expertise and resources to expose their crimes. And she said that Richard had told her, "We need to make an example of the judge to show everyone else what happens when you don't cooperate." And when Patricia broke down crying on the stand, describing how she had been too afraid to stand up to her husband, and how she would have to live with the guilt of her actions for the rest of her life, several jurors were visibly moved. And Sarah said you could feel the mood in the courtroom shift as everyone realized that these weren't just financial crimes. They had destroyed lives and families and communities. Marcus Webb also testified, describing in chilling detail how Richard Pemberton had approached him in late September and asked if he would be willing to do a special job for $25,000 cash, and Marcus admitted that he had initially been reluctant because he knew arson was a serious crime, but Richard had convinced him by saying that the house was old and falling apart anyway, and that burning it down would actually be doing everyone a favor because it was an eyesore in the neighborhood, which was a complete lie given that my home had been meticulously maintained and was considered one of the most beautiful historical properties in the area. And Marcus testified that Richard had provided him with detailed instructions about how to start the fire, to make it look like an electrical malfunction, and he had given him photographs of my house, including images showing the location of the electrical panel and the best points of entry. And Marcus described how he had surveilled my property for 3 days before the attack, learning my routines and making sure he knew when I would be home and when the fire would cause maximum damage. and he admitted that he had used a combination of gasoline and an electrical starter to ignite the fire in the early morning hours of October 15th, and he had watched from his car parked down the street as the flames spread through my home. And he said that he had felt sick to his stomach as he watched the house burn, realizing that he had destroyed something irreplaceable and that someone could have been killed. And he testified that when Richard had paid him the second half of the money 2 days later, Richard had said, "This never happened, you were never here, and if anyone asks, you don't know me." And Marcus's testimony was particularly powerful because he had no reason to lie. He had already pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his testimony corroborated everything Patricia had said about Richard's involvement in the arson. The defense tried to argue that Patricia's testimony couldn't be trusted because she had her own legal problems and was cooperating to save herself from prison, and they tried to suggest that Marcus Webb was the one who had come up with the plan to burn my house and that he was now falsely implicating Richard to get a better deal. But the prosecution countered with documentary evidence, including bank records showing the $25,000 cash withdrawal Richard had made just days before the fire, cell phone records showing multiple calls between Richard and Marcus in the weeks leading up to the arson, and most damningly, emails that Richard had sent to Patricia and Brandon, discussing the need to eliminate the judge problem and references to the project with Marcus. And the prosecution also called dozens of homeowners who testified about the Pembertons' pattern of harassment and intimidation, and several of them broke down in tears as they described how they had been forced out of their homes and how their lives had been destroyed by the HOA's abuse. And by the time the prosecution rested its case after 3 weeks of testimony, it was clear that the jury had heard more than enough to convict, and the defense only called a handful of witnesses who mostly provided character testimony, saying that Richard had always seemed like a nice man and a good neighbor, which rang hollow given the mountain of evidence showing his criminal conduct. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning with their verdict guilty on all counts, and Sarah told me that Richard showed no emotion when the verdicts were read. He just sat there staring straight ahead as if he couldn't process what was happening. And when Judge Martinez polled the jury to confirm the verdict, each juror clearly and firmly stated guilty for every single count, and Richard was immediately remanded into custody pending sentencing, and his attorney requested a few minutes to speak with his client, and Sarah said that she watched through the courtroom windows as Richard and Lawrence Blackstone had what appeared to be a heated conversation, with Richard gesturing wildly and Blackstone shaking his head repeatedly. And when they emerged, Blackstone announced to the court that his client wished to make a statement, and Judge Martinez allowed it, and Richard stood up and said, his voice shaking, "I want to apologize to Judge Chen and to all the homeowners I've hurt. I know that nothing I say can undo the damage I've caused, and I take full responsibility for my actions. I let power and greed corrupt me, and I lost sight of what was right, and I am truly sorry." But his apology rang hollow to everyone in the courtroom because it was clearly a calculated attempt to win sympathy from the judge before sentencing, and the prosecution immediately stood up and reminded the court that Richard had shown no remorse throughout the investigation or trial, that he had continued to try to intimidate witnesses even after his arrest, and that his apology only came after he had been convicted and faced serious prison time. Brandon Pemberton and several other defendants in the broader conspiracy also went to trial, and they too were convicted on various charges, and the entire criminal enterprise that had terrorized homeowners for over a decade was finally dismantled, and the sentencing hearings were held in June, and I attended Richard Pemberton's sentencing in my capacity as a victim, not as a judge, and I sat in the spectator section alongside dozens of other homeowners who had been victimized by his crimes, and the prosecutors had prepared a comprehensive sentencing memorandum documenting every crime, every victim, and every dollar stolen, and they recommended a sentence of 25 years in federal prison followed by supervised release and full restitution to all victims. And the defense argued for leniency, claiming that Richard was a first-time offender who had shown remorse and who posed no future danger to society. But Judge Martinez was having none of it, and during the sentencing hearing, he said, "Mr. Pemberton, you held a position of trust in your community, and you abused that trust in the most egregious ways imaginable. You stole from your neighbors. You terrorized families. You drove people out of their homes, and when a federal judge had the courage to stand up to you, you arranged to have her house burned down in an attempt to intimidate her and to destroy evidence of your crimes. Your actions weren't just greedy, they were evil, and they caused immeasurable harm to hundreds of people. and the only reason you're apologizing now is because you got caught and you're trying to minimize your punishment. But this court will not be swayed by crocodile tears or last-minute expressions of remorse." Judge Martinez then turned to me and asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, and I stood up and walked to the podium, and I looked directly at Richard Pemberton as I spoke, and I said, "Mr. Pemberton, you burned down the house my grandmother built with her own hands, the house where 3 generations of my family were born and raised, and you did it because I refused to submit to your authority and because you were afraid that I would expose your crimes. And you were right to be afraid, because that's exactly what I did, and now you're going to pay the price for your actions. But I want you to know that while you destroyed my house, you didn't destroy me or my family's legacy, and we're rebuilding, not just the physical structure, but also the community that you tried to control through fear and intimidation. And every family you victimized is getting justice today, and that is worth more than any house could ever be." And when I finished, Richard wouldn't even look at me. He just stared down at the table with his hands clasped together. And Judge Martinez sentenced him to 28 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, and he ordered full restitution to all victims totaling over $4.2 million. And Richard was led out of the courtroom in shackles, and I felt a sense of closure wash over me knowing that justice had been served. Brandon Pemberton received 12 years, Patricia received 5 years for her cooperation, and Marcus Webb received 8 years for the arson. And over the following months, all the other defendants in the conspiracy were sentenced to various prison terms, and the Clearwater Hills HOA was dissolved by court order and replaced with a new association run by homeowners who were committed to transparency and accountability. And I used my insurance money to rebuild my grandmother's house exactly as it had been, using the original blueprints and photographs, hiring craftsmen who specialized in historic restoration, and when it was finally completed 18 months after the fire, I stood in the driveway of my restored home, surrounded by my new neighbors who had brought food and flowers to welcome me back, and I felt grateful not just for the house but for the community that had emerged from the ashes of the Pembertons' corruption, a community built on trust and mutual respect rather than fear and intimidation. And as I walked through the front door of my grandmother's house, restored to its former glory, I thought about how she would have been proud, not just that I had rebuilt the house, but that I had stood up for what was right and had helped bring justice to so many people who had been suffering in silence. And I realized that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can lead to the best outcomes if we have the courage to fight back and refuse to be victims. And that is exactly what I did. And now Richard Pemberton and his criminal enterprise were nothing but a bad memory, while I was home again, surrounded by the legacy of my family and the promise of a better future. The end.